Let's start off by looking at South Africa as a case study of an African nation who perhaps has escaped imperialism a little quicker than others. The racial background of South Africa is quite different than most African nations. There's about 3 million whites. Of those 3 million whites, most are Dutch or Boers. The others were British. They also had about 18 million blacks. Probably the largest tribe would be the Zulu or the Xhosa, but there are a variety of Bantu tribes and some that aren't even Bantu. Then you had almost a million Indians that were brought to work on things like the railroads. It's also important to remember that Gandhi, for a while, lived in South Africa. Then you had about a million what were called coloreds that were a mixed race people, black and white for the most part. So Great Britain decided that they were going to give South Africa freedom in 1910, which is really just about a decade after the Boer War was fought, where Britain asserted control over the white Boer population. This freedom mostly was in the hands of the Boer population. They created their own party, the Afrikaners Nationalist Party, and they instituted the system that we would call apartheid, which means separateness, which separated the races. So, for instance, the black populations had to reside in various homelands or Bantustans. South Africa did have a very good economy based on its mineral wealth, also its advancement in the cities of Pretoria or Johannesburg. So compared to the rest of Africa, it had a pretty mature industrial economy. The ANC, or the African National Congress, was formed around 1912. Its goal is to bring about black majority rule. And they would go through various stages, some violent, some not, where they would try to force the minority white government to give up power, which they don't really do until the 1990. But to control the black population, the white government instituted what were called pass laws, and these pass books had to be carried by the black population, which showed where their tribal homeland was and where they worked. So separateness, apartheid. Nelson Mandela is the figure on the left. When the Afrikaner Nationalist Party finally gives up power in 1990 and agrees to all race elections, it's no doubt that the leader of the ANC, Nelson Mandela, is going to win. And that is the leader of the Afrikaner Nationalists congratulating Mandela on his election. So you can see the various Bantu stands in South Africa, many of them named after the tribes, for instance, Lesotho, Swaziland. And you can also see the various townships. These are like the black homelands in the north. Not very nice at all, really, and definitely a lot poorer than the white areas. So many of these leaders were underground, but by especially the 1980s, but really the 70s, it began. There was a lot of international pressure on the white Afrikaner government to allow majority rule. And negotiations began in the late 1980s. Nelson Mandela had been held on Robbers Island off Cape Town, I believe, for 29 years. He was released from prison, and he was allowed to run, and he would win the 94 elections. And the ANC has come to power in 94. It's now 2021, so 27 years later, the ANC is still in power. Again, the picture on the left shows the tremendous contrast between the great wealth of some of the cities of South Africa, yet the great poverty of some of the homelands. And you can see the ANC pretty much running the government, from Nelson to Thabo Mbeki to Zuma to Ramaphosa. So democracy is more fragile in Africa, even to this very day. You can't really look at a lot of African nations and say they have a good history of democracy. Instead, they tend to have a history of strongman rule, meaning one party, one leader gets in power and doesn't want to give up that power. So there's a lot of reasons why people say that democracy is more fragile in Africa. The tradition of village authority or the headman authority is a big one. But really, it's difficult to create a multi-party system. Most Africans tend to vote upon ethnic lines. So even though you have, so for instance, in Nigeria's Hausas or Fulanis, Hausas tend to vote for Hausa candidates and Fulani for Fulani candidates. So there was a lot of widespread disappointment in Africa after they did get independence, and that led to the well-educated elite that benefited the most. They were in greater position to take over companies that produced wealth or achieve different political positions. I like this statue. This is in Mozambique. There was a very bloody war that took place between a nationalist group known as Renamo and the government, which was Marxist and Soviet influenced. When they agreed to peace, they took down their weapons, and these are all assault weapons that they turned into like this peace tree. So you can see the Cold War often played itself out throughout Africa, where we would support one side and the Soviet Union would support another. So is poverty inevitable? Are there always going to be haves and have-nots? A lot of times what you see, especially in African countries, but throughout the world, is that those in power tend to enrich themselves and their friends. Probably the best example I can think of this is Robert Mugabe, who ruled Zimbabwe from its independence all the way up until just a few years ago. And he and his supporters in his party were wealthy, but the vast majority of people were dirt poor. So how do you spur that economic development? Does the world governing body, like for instance the United Nations, have a role in that? I know the United States, especially under George W. Bush, invested heavily in Africa. Or is it more shielding their economy, where they should protect certain industries and not allow any foreign involvement or ownership? Most of the wealth tends to be in the urban areas, and most of the poverty has been in the rural areas, which is even true in the United States for such a long time, and is true throughout many regions, like for instance Italy. So how much should the foreign investment be relied upon in order to help extricate these countries from poverty? So basically, region by region, it led to different degrees of economic development. Some nations have done a little bit better, but then again, some nations, like for instance Angola or Nigeria, have oil wealth. Other nations have mineral wealth, like for instance Botswana has diamonds. It tends to help them a little better than maybe other countries that have greater poverty. Here you see problems in the Middle East, and much of this has to do, of course, with the Israeli versus Palestinian conflict. After World War II, Israel was created. We talked about Zionism and the fact that there's a belief that Jews should return to the land that God gave them. Unfortunately, much of that land was occupied by Palestinians. When Israel was created at the end of World War II, the land was evenly divided, but then when Israel declared its independence it was invaded by its more numerous Arab neighbors. Israel would fight hard and take not only its land, but the Palestinians' land, which expelled them. They'd be invaded several times in their history, and each time they would win and expand their territories. They now rule what's called the occupied territories, the Golan Heights, the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank of the Jordan River. But they have negotiated to give some of these areas to Palestinian control in what many refer to as the two-state solution. The Arab world, of course, controls a big chunk of the world's oil supply. In 1973, to punish the United States for supporting Israel in the Yom Kippur War, they cut off our oil, which led to long gas lines and high gas prices. Today, I know President Trump was trying to negotiate a lot of peace agreements. He did get Morocco and Jordan and Qatar and a couple other states to recognize Israel's right to exist. President Carter, got Egypt to recognize Israel's right to exist. Iran tends to be the biggest antagonist towards Israel and would like to see Israel wiped off from the face of the earth, to put it mildly. Iran used to be our best ally in the Middle East, Iran and Turkey. Both were secular for a long time, which meant non-religious. Women were allowed to wear Western dress. They acted much like America. But that has changed a lot. Turkey under Erdogan has moved more towards religious rule. Erdogan is more like an old Ottoman sultan than he is like a modern Turkish president. And Iran in 1979 had an Islamic revolution and would become an Islamic theocracy, a Shiite Islamic theocracy. And they're behind many groups that the United States constantly battles with. For instance, Hezbollah in Lebanon, or the Houthis in Yemen. And so they often are behind the attacks on Israel. As I mentioned, they would definitely like to see Israel wiped out. And they're not very fond of us. They call us the Great Satan, mainly because we took the Shah of Iran and gave him refuge. So Iran, it's kind of been debated. Biden has resurrected some of Obama's policies where they try to negotiate with Iran, whereas Trump tried to isolate with Iran. What does the future hold with U.S.-Iranian relations? That's a pretty darn good question, and that's one above my pay grade. So I should probably leave it at that. Again, there are the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, as they call themselves, enforcing Islamic law on the people of Iran. And that is that.